In the year 1859, one of the most significant things that has happened in the scientific circles is the fact that there was a man by the name of Charles Darwin who, previous to that particular year, had gone on a 5-year trip on the S.H. Beagle. And this boat was a boat that traveled all over, especially to the Galapagos Islands. And he, as he went through these travels, decided that he was going to put forth an idea called evolution. Most of us are familiar with the idea. In some ways, the term evolution is just simply defined as change over time. But that's not how you probably understand the word evolution. The word evolution most of the time means that there was a simple life form that over multiplied millions of years evolved into the highest life form that we have on this earth, and that would be humans. Something like a single-celled amoeba over multiplied millions of years of time and chance and random processes had some mutations in its genome, and those mutations caused it to be able to mutate into a bacteria, and that bacteria over millions of years mutated into something more complex, and that's what Charles Darwin put forth in 1859. His book was an immediate bestseller, sold every single copy that he had that year, and they subsequently translated that into multiple different languages and started sending that all over the world. And has now been adopted by the United States and many other countries as the official establishment teaching, that idea of evolution. Several years ago in Cobb County, Georgia, the Board of Education decided that they were going to put this particular statement in their biology textbooks. You can read it with me, I hope you will. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. Regarding the origin of living things, this material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Well, that looks like a statement that you would say about any belief. If someone were to say, Kyle, how should you approach your idea of creation in Christianity? Well, I would say look at it carefully, with an open mind, and critically consider it. In fact, that's a biblical principle. If you were to go to 1 Thessalonians, you look in chapter 5, it says, test all things, hold on to what's good. Now, this sticker was put in the front pages, actually the front cover page of the biology textbooks in Cobb County, Georgia, and someone who does not believe in God sued the school board and wanted this sticker out of those books. And here's why they said they wanted it. They said it was a violation of the separation of church and state. They said that this sticker was unconstitutional because it was so religious. Now, the fact of the matter is that's a misunderstanding of the separation of church and state. If you were to pull out your dollar bill and look on top of the back of your dollar bill, you would see a statement, "In God we trust." The idea that somehow the government can't help support Christianity or the teaching of the Bible, that's just false. That's never been what the Constitution has said. However, let's step back and ask ourselves this question. This was ripped out of the textbooks and deemed as unconstitutional. Now, let us see what part of this sticker is religious. Let's read it again. This textbook contains material on evolution. It's a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Do you read anything about God in there? Anything about the Bible? Anything about Jesus? Now, it was considered unconstitutional because the judge said it violated the separation of church and state, said this sticker was just too religious. But you'll notice there's nothing religious about it at all. Now, let me explain to you the underpinnings, the thing that was the reason this was considered too religious. I have a friend who works with us. You know, sometimes when somebody is talking about something that they don't feel like takes a whole lot of intelligence, they'll say, well, that's not rocket science. Well, what do they mean when they say that's not rocket science? What they mean is if it were rocket science, it would take somebody really, really smart to do it, because rocket science is pretty much on the high end of what you need in brain capacity to do it. I mean, rocket science is tough. Most of us aren't going to be rocket scientists, but some of us are. In fact, a friend of mine who writes with us and works for us, his name is Mike Housen. That's exactly what he is. He's a rocket scientist. He is a basically a team leader at NASA. I think he's got 26 people underneath him, and they build rockets. That's what they do. Now, Mike Houts grew up as an atheist. In his family, he just was taught that there wasn't a God. He went through the academic circles and bought basically everything they were selling about evolution and atheism. And sometime along the way, after he went through school, he got a PhD from MIT in aeronautic engineering, if I understand it right. And so he's got this, basically the rocket science degree. And at some point he thinks, hey, they've been telling me this stuff about evolution for years and years. I wonder if it's right. And so he started looking at evolution with an open mind. And he started studying it carefully and critically considering it. And now he's a New Testament Christian. Now, the reason that people would consider this sticker as religious is because if you really did decide, okay, I've been told that this is true, but I want to see if it's the case, and you start studying it, a person who is honest, who with an open mind studies evolution, is going to realize, hey, they haven't been teaching me correctly about that. And then if they continue to be honest and they think, I want to know the truth, they're going to arrive at the conclusion there's a God. And then if they keep going and say, I'm going to study this stuff carefully with an open mind, which God, they're going to find out that the Bible is God's Word, and then they're going to become Christians. Now, in one sense, this statement is not religious at all. Look at evolution with an open mind, study it carefully, critically consider it. What happens when you do that? Well, that's what I'm going to do for you today. My co-worker, Eric Lyons, and I have gone through your biology textbooks, and we have taken everything we can find about how the evolutionary community teaches evolution. Now, the first problem, the first challenge that the evolutionary community has is getting life here. You guys might know the law of biogenesis. You might not know it real formally, but you know exactly what it means. Law of biogenesis says that in this natural world, life comes only from previously existing life of its own kind. Now, it doesn't sound real profound unless it's 1600 AD. Because in 1600 AD, they don't think that. They think life just pops into existence from nothing. And so they're going to tell you in your science books about a guy who, in about 1640, 1650, mid-1600s, they would take a steak and put it on their kitchen counter and leave it in the middle of the summer with the windows open for a couple weeks. Sounds pretty disgusting. What happens when you take a steak and leave it on your kitchen counter in the middle of the summer with the windows open? What starts to form on that steak? All kinds of stuff. Some of it's green and fuzzy, etc., but some of it's white and crawly. Maggots start to form on a steak in the middle of the summer with the windows open on your kitchen counter. And did you see any maggots crawl onto the steak? No. Did you see any maggots fall out of the air onto the steak? No. How did the maggots get there? Well, in 1650 AD, people thought that maggots just spontaneously generated from non-living chemicals. And so they came up with this idea of abiogenesis, not bio. They said, hey, life can just pop into existence from non-living chemicals. Now, according to your idea of evolution, there had to be a warm pond somewhere of non-living chemicals that somehow got together and formed the first life, the first living cell, and that living cell supposedly evolved into the next multi-cell bacteria, etc. But when you start looking at how life actually gets here, 1650, they said it just pops into existence from non-living chemicals. They said, if that's not enough information, evidence for you, I've got some more. Take old sweaty rags, wrap them in wheat, and stick them in the corner of your barn. You know what you get when you take old sweaty rags, wrap them in wheat, wrap them in wheat, and put them in the corner of your barn? You know what spontaneously generates, they said? Mice. They just pop into existence from the chemical processes of old sweaty rags and wheat, and that's how living mice come to be. Now, of course, when a man by the name of Francisco Redi in 1650 heard that idea of spontaneous generation, he said, you know what? I'm just not sure that maggots form on meat spontaneously. I think there's got to be a better answer to that. And so here's what he did. It's real simple. He took some jars, put meat in the bottom of them, left them open. So let's say we got 5 jars over here. There's meat at the bottom of them. They don't have anything on the top. Then he took some jars and put some meat in the bottom of them and sealed them airtight. And he watched both sets of jars. Not hard, pretty simple experiment. Flies landed on the meat that was uncovered. Flies tried to land on the covered meat, but they couldn't. Maggots formed on the uncovered meat. Nothing formed on the meat that was covered. Okay? He said, you know what I think? I think that flies are producing the maggots. I don't think they're spontaneously generated. People said, no, they're spontaneously generated. Here's your problem. Your problem is you didn't let air get into the meat that was covered, because air, the chemicals and stuff that goes on in the atmosphere and the air, that's what forms life, those non-living chemicals. He said, okay, well, let's take that idea and make this experiment a little more complicated, but not too much. Meat over here is totally sealed. Meat over here uncovered, and then in the middle he had a group of jars where he put meat at the bottom and put something like medical gauze on top of it, like a little netting, so that air could get in but nothing else could. Pretty simple. No maggots on the meat that was sealed, maggots on the meat that was unsealed, maggots in the netting on the meat that was covered with the little netting, but no maggots on the meat. And he said, there you go. Flies are producing maggots. And everybody said, wow, that's profound. I think you're exactly right. So, Reedy, do you think that no life spontaneously generates? He said, no, I think some does. I just don't think maggots do. Okay. And so for another 200 years or so, Francisco Reedy had disproven that maggots spontaneously generate, but he kind of thought other stuff still did. Until about 1860. 1860, the milk that you drank made a significant turn of events in 1860. If you ever pull out a gallon of milk and you look on the side, you're going to read that it is pasteurized. Now, that's real simple. We all understand what pasteurized means. It means that the cows that produced that milk lived and ate in a... No, not a pasture. That's what does pasteurized mean? Well, here's what it means. If you were to look at the way it's spelled, you would see that it's not spelled like a regular pasture. It is spelled like pasture. Okay, now what's the difference? There, Louis Pasteur in 1860 said, look, spontaneous generation, that's a ridiculous idea. It's ascientific. It is not true. In fact, he said, I'm going to prove it to you that it's not true. And so he would take meat broth and put it in special flasks with long S-shaped curves. They're very thin, and those long S-shaped curves allowed air to go back into the meat broth, but stopped all microscopic organisms in the little curve, the little bend of the S shape. And so he would boil the meat broth, put it in those special flasks, boil it, and wait. Now by 1860 they had microscopes, and they could zoom in, and you could see millions of tiny little microscopic organisms swimming around in the meat broth before you boiled it. After you boiled it, they're all dead. The air goes back into the meat broth. The tiny S-shaped curve stops all of the microorganisms. Nothing forms in the meat broth. They wait an hour, nothing. Wait a day, nothing. Waited a month, nothing. In fact, if I understand it right, the experiment went so long, some of them, he sat for a year in certain places and no meat broth formed any more microscopic organisms until he would break the S-shaped curve neck off of the flask. And when he would do that, air would go immediately back in, and those microscopic organisms would go back in with that air and would form in the meat broth. Since 1868, every single legitimate scientific statement about life says life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. So number one, life cannot come into existence from non-living chemicals without some type of intelligence. That first aspect of evolution, that somehow life popped into existence from non-living chemicals, well, it just doesn't work. It's just not scientific. In fact, what's interesting to me is when you go through the textbooks, you can start in about second grade, second grade, and go all the way up to about the 10th grade, and they will tell you all about Pasteur and how Pasteur and Spallanzani and Reedy disproved the idea of spontaneous generation. And they will tell you that all life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. And then in the next paragraph sometimes, they will say, but in the past, That must have been different because we have life now that's spontaneously generated from non-living chemicals. So basically what they say is we know what the science says, but if evolution is going to be true, that science can't be right. And so we're going to tell you something that's not scientific. Now the second problem with evolution is not only does the law of biogenesis say it comes from previously existing life, but it says life of its own kind. Now this you understand real well. Years ago I had a dog. This dog's name was Max. And we were moving from East Tennessee to Middle Tennessee. And Max was about to have babies. And so she was on the trip with us. She was in the floor of the U-Haul van. And she was going to have babies actually the night we were moving. And so we took her out and put her in the bathtub of the hotel. I remember doing that and thinking, wow, I have a weird family. What are we doing here? But subsequently I've looked up that people do that sometimes. So I'm not as weird as I originally thought. But the next morning we got up, went to that bathtub to see what had happened in the night. And Max had 8 of the most beautiful baby hippopotamuses you have ever seen. They were miniature. They were the miniature kind, you know, and they were there in the tub. They just looked right at home. Do you think Max had 8 baby hippopotamuses? No, were you there? You weren't there. If I were to stand in front of you and say, my dog gave birth to 8 baby hippopotami, you could not argue from experience. Actually, that experience, you couldn't say, no, I was there, I saw those, but you wouldn't believe that for 1 second. Why wouldn't you believe that? Because dogs give birth to, well, what if I change it? You're right, okay, of course. My dog did not have 8 baby hippopotami. That's ridiculous. Here's what it really happened. I went in the next morning, there was my dog, had given birth to 8 of the most beautiful half dog, half birds that you have ever seen. We called them bogs. They were the cutest thing. Just the last half of them had feathers. The front half had fur. Okay, they weren't really full hippopotami. Okay, would you believe that? No. Because dogs give birth to, well, no, hold on. You're right. All right, that's not true. They didn't have any bogs. Here's what really happened. All right, my dog, I went up the next morning. I looked in, and there were 8 of the most beautiful 99% dog, 1% lizards that you've ever seen. They just had a few little scales right on their head, and you could just rub we called them dizzards or logs. They were so cute, and we sold those. Oh, do you believe that? You weren't there. Here's what you know. In fact, every single biological experiment, listen to me, ever done in the history of biology, ever, says that life comes from previously existing life, its own kind and nature, and gives birth to life of its own kind. Now, you can get a Chihuahua or a St. Bernard from the dog kind, but dogs don't give birth to a different kind of animal. They don't give birth to hippopotami. They don't give birth to half dog, half bird. They don't give birth to 99% dog, 1% lizard. Dogs have puppies. Cats have kittens. Cows have calves. That's a biological, scientific fact. Now listen to me. It's a fact. It's a law. There's never been a single exception. If there was ever a single exception, it wouldn't be a law anymore. But what does evolution say? Life popped into existence from non-living chemicals, and then it changed from a single-celled amoeba to multicell bacteria. And then somehow that multicell bacteria gave birth to something other than itself and brought into existence something like a worm. And then that worm somehow had to give birth to something other than itself that brought into existence something like a fish. And this didn't have to happen once. It didn't have to happen twice. This had to have happened millions and millions of times over the course of history, and there's never been a single exception to the law of biogenesis. See, the fact of the matter is evolution is not a scientific idea. The most experiments that they've done trying to get something to give birth to something other than itself probably is with the fruit fly. For the last 100 years, the scientific community has said, hey, if we could just accelerate how many generations we get and we could mutate those things, then we should be able to get something else. And so they've taken a fruit fly, because here's why it's a great candidate. Fruit flies have babies every 14 days. And so you can have a new generation of fruit flies every 14 days, and they have taken these fruit flies and they've dumped chemicals on them, and they've shot them with little radiation lasers, and they've done all kinds of stuff in the last 100 years to the fruit fly. Poor guy. I mean, just have made the fruit fly where it can grow wings on its head, made it where it can grow legs on its head, made it where it can grow wings where its legs are supposed to be, have done everything you can imagine to radiate and mutate a fruit fly. In fact, they have what would be the equivalent of millions of years of evolution in the last 100 years, because they, every single 14 days, get a new generation and zap it with something. Get a new generation and zap it with something. New generation and zap it with something. You know how many things other than a fruit fly they have come up with? In 100 years of zapping it with every type of mutagenic substance that they can find, guess what a fruit fly still is? Still a fruit fly. They haven't even gotten it to change into any kind of other fly than the fruit fly, and they've zapped it with everything. And so the first problem that the evolutionist runs into is that law of biogenesis. Now, the second problem is the stuff that's used to prove evolution, well, it just doesn't prove it at all. If you were to look at it with an open mind, study it carefully, critically consider it, here's what would happen. You'd come to a story like this: the English peppered moth. All right, here's what the story is presented as in most of your textbooks. Like I said, me and Eric have gone through tons of textbooks, and this is the stuff we get to see how they're teaching evolution. Most of the time when I go and present this to somebody, I have multiple people come to me afterward and say, hey, we just got done studying that last week, or we just got done studying that last year. This is still what's in most all of your textbook standard stuff. Here's the story. You look at this, and here's your English peppered moth. You can hardly even see that moth right there because it is so well camouflaged against the lichens on the trunk of the tree. This unfortunate soul, however, is not quite so camouflaged. In fact, he's much darker. And if you were a bird, I know it's hard to think about being a bird, but if you were, which of these two would you decide you wanted for breakfast? Well, you wouldn't decide you wanted that one for breakfast because you couldn't even see it, and so you would eat this one because you could see it much better. That's the story. And so what we're told is, before the Industrial Revolution, when the lichens grew in multitudes on the tree trunks and the light-colored moths were camouflaged, the dark-colored moths were easy to see and the birds ate them. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, when the soot was put into the atmosphere and killed all of the lichens on the trees, and this poor soul was no longer as camouflaged as it used to be, the ratio of dark to light moths changed from 95% light to 95% dark, and from 5% dark to 5% light. And this was called, if you can see this right here, it's kind of like evolution in action. They said this is an example of evolution, folks. Here's what has happened. Nature has selected the most viable variety of the English peppered moth. Now, stop right there. Sounds like a really great story, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds like, wow, you got it. You just proved evolution. You just proved that humans evolved from single-celled amoebas right there with this piece of evidence. Except, let's look at it just a minute. Couple questions that if you critically consider it, if you look through it. Number one, before the Industrial Revolution, there was genetic information in the moth population to form two varieties of moth. What were they? Dark and light. After the Industrial Revolution, there was genetic information in the moth population to form what? Two varieties of moth. What were they? Dark and light. Was any new genetic information added? Like information that would let you get something other than a moth? Okay, let's give you an equivalent. Let's suppose that we had a dog, and that dog gave birth to 10 puppies. And 9 of those puppies, let's say 8 of those puppies were light-colored puppies, 2 of those puppies were dark-colored. Okay? Easy to understand. And then, tragically, that puppy and those dogs are walking across a pond, and the ice is kind of thin, and sadly, 7 of those light-colored puppies fall into the pond, and they don't make it. And so now we've got 2 dark-colored and 1 light-colored, twice as many dark as light. What do we now have? Evolution in action. Is that what you've got? No. You just had 7 puppies that died, and the genetic information in the puppy group didn't change at all. You didn't change a puppy into anything other than a puppy. The genetic information didn't change at all. And so as you look at that, what changed in the genetic information of the English peppered moth? Nothing. Now what you need is a lot of added genetic information to get a single-celled amoeba up to a human. This is supposed to prove that to you, and yet it doesn't prove one thing. Oh, now, incidentally, most of you, as kids, probably have never tried to do this. You've probably been involved in the frustration of your parents when you were smaller, when they wanted to take Easter pictures of you. Because if you've ever tried to get a 2-year-old, an 8-month-old, and a 4-year-old to stand still for Easter pictures and not chase the little duck that you've bought for them to hold on the front steps of your porch, if you've ever tried that, which most of you have not, I'm not saying I have, but if you have, you understand what a frustrating system that is to try to get them all to stand or sit exactly where you want. But look at these pictures again. You know, sometimes you miss some of the biggest stuff. Man, aren't these such compliant English peppered moths? You know, thank you. Do they have them trained so you can just whistle them over? Come here, come on, come on. And all right, fly right there and just stay. How do you get an English peppered moth that, incidentally, in about the 60 years that they've been studying them, they don't land on tree trunks. They land on the underside of green leaves, and their dark and light color doesn't really have much at all to do with whether they live or not. So somehow you've got some English peppered moths that in the course of about 50 or 60 years, they've only seen really, I think, a total of 4, if I understand it correctly, land on tree trunks. How did you get these to work perfectly for you for the photograph that you wanted to put in your textbook? It's interesting. Have you ever stopped to look at that with an open mind and study it real carefully and critically consider it? Hey, how'd they get these pictures? That's a real good question. And the answer to that is, well, they just made them up. They didn't go out into nature and take pictures of English peppered moths that were landed perfectly on trees. You know, it'd be hard to get them in the same frame, wouldn't it? No, in fact, what they did was they glued the peppered moths on there, or they caught them and artificially placed them on there, or they pinned them on there. Now, they just don't land on tree trunks like this. Now, what you'd like to think is, okay, in the textbooks, most all textbooks are teaching this stuff, but they don't know any better. And so if you just told them, they would say, we've been teaching evolution with this kind of information for years. We're sorry, we'll take that out. No, that's not how it goes down most of the time. In fact, Bob Ritter, Canadian textbook writer, he knew the peppered moths were fake, but here's what he said. You got to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? He says, I know this is fake, but it's just so simple that we don't want the kids to misunderstand what's going on. We're going to keep using it because it's so simple. We know it's not right, but it's just really easy to understand. And then he says, the advantage of this example of natural selection is it's extremely visual. Okay, let's see how that works. Suppose I have a groundbreaking theory, guys. Here's what I've got. I believe that when white cows eat green grass, they naturally grow purple spots. And you say, Kyle, that's ridiculous. Of course, white cows don't grow purple spots. I say, no. I believe I can prove this to you. And so if you will just come tomorrow for our morning class service, I'll have some cows out front. For Bible class, I'll put them out there, and we'll let them eat that green grass for about an hour. And then just before we have our worship service, if we go out there, I'll show that they have grown purple spots. And so for Bible class, you don't see me anywhere, but you do see me put those cows out, and all the teachers teach their classes and things. And then I call everybody out to see my white cows. And sure enough, all over these white cows, Leland, there are purple spots. They're about the size of a baseball, just purple spots everywhere. And you think, that's interesting. Kyle said he had a groundbreaking theory that white cows that eat green grass. I showed where they had been eating green grass out there. They've got purple spots. You say, wow, this is amazing. Some of you who are a little bit more comfortable around cows, one of you goes up to one and you pet the cow. And then like your forehead itches or something, you itch your forehead. And somebody starts looking at you and they start laughing at you. And they say, what do you got on your face? And you start looking, and sure enough, on your hand and on your face, you got purple paint all over your hand and your face. And you say, wonder where I got that purple paint? And you realize you had been petting that cow. So you get a paper towel, and you go out there with that paper towel, and you start rubbing some of those spots off of that cow. And sure enough, those spots rub right off. And you come to me and you say, Kyle, those cows didn't grow those purple spots. You painted them on there, didn't you? I said, yeah. You said, well, you can't do that. That doesn't prove your point. I said, yeah, but the advantage of this example is it's very visual. So what are you saying then? Oh, it's fake, but you can see it real good. Well, thank you. I thought you were supposed to be proving evolution to us. Well, no, we're not really proving it. We're just wanting you to believe it. We don't give you real evidence for this. And if you look at it with an open mind, you study it carefully, and you critically consider it, that's going to be problematic. So let's make sure we don't encourage anybody to do that. Let's make sure if there's a sticker that says, look at this stuff with an open mind, study carefully, critically consider, we rip that out. Because if they do, there's going to be real problems with a bunch of the evidence we used to teach them, because this evidence doesn't prove what we say it proves. And you see, you got a problem there. Continue with me. This guy's name is Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel in 1860, he was a German. He read for the first time Charles Darwin's Origin of Species by Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races. And he said, this is the greatest idea I've ever heard. This is amazing. In fact, I'm going to prove it. And he came up with an idea, a theory called the law of embryology. And here's what he said. Now listen close, I think you'll all get this the very first time I say it. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And don't you just feel smarter when you hear that? You don't even have to understand it. It's just like, And he taught at the University of Jena, and he would teach his kids, his university students, evolution is true because ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And they would say, yes, master, that is true. What in the world does ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny mean? Well, here's what he said. He said the ontogeny of an organism, that is its growth from conception to being born. The ontogeny recapitulates, goes through again its phylogeny, its evolutionary history. So if you were to watch an organism from the time it was conceived to the time it was born, you would see, if it was a human, you would see it in a fish stage, you would see it in a worm stage, you'd see it in a monkey stage, and then ultimately you'd see it in a human stage. You just have to zoom in at the right time, and you see it in any given stage. Its ontogeny, its growth, recaps, goes back through its phylogeny, its evolutionary history. And so they said, well, you got any evidence for this? He said, yeah, got all kinds. This is what he showed them. He said, look at this. I mean, you got a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a dog, a human, and look right here. They look almost identical. And then right here, they look almost, and this is the fish stage, where you have these organisms, they all have gill slits, and then as a human grows, it grows out of gill slits, etc. And so the law of embryology was placed in most every single textbook that you have read in the last 100 years. Problem, when even some of his own colleagues in 1890 started looking at these pictures, they said, hold on just a second, that doesn't look a thing like the embryos we deal with. That embryo you drew of the salamander, I mean, it just is not looking like, right there, where's the salamander right there? That doesn't look like what we see as the salamander. The rabbit, doesn't really, I mean, those don't match what we see. Where'd you get those pictures? He said, oh, I drew some of them from memory. And he said, sometimes I'd take one embryo, draw it 3 times, and name it 3 different things. Okay, so I'd take a dog embryo, I draw that same one 3 times with a few little adjustments, and I name it a dog, a pig, and a human. They said, so you just kind of made this stuff up? Yeah, but it proves my point really well. Okay, well, hold on just a second. Number 1, it doesn't prove your point at all. And number 2, you made it up. And so, as you look at many of the evolutionary teachers who do believe in evolution, this stuff is in most every textbook for the last 100 years. Now, here's what they say, though. This guy, his name's Stephen Jay Gould. I don't know if you'll remember him at all, but he was the leading evolutionist of his day. And here's what he wrote. He said, Haeckel remains most famous today as the chief architect and propagandist for a famous argument that science disproved long ago. Now, it's in most every textbook for the last 100 years, and science disproved it probably 5 to 10 years after it was put out, but it was just so convincing, the textbook writers have left it in there for the last 100 years. Now, notice what Stephen Jay Gould says. He says, we should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by a century of mindless recycling. Now, let me tell you where this leads. Generally speaking, I get lots of criticism in my work. People will write me things like, hey, you people at Apologetics Press are the dumbest people I've ever seen. You need to quit lying to people and start teaching them real science. You need to take everything off your website and enter the 21st century. Stuff like that. Now, generally speaking, when someone criticizes our material, what I say is, hey, appreciate you taking the time to write. Could you give me the one piece of evidence that you think is most powerful, that you think proves evolution or shows there's no God or something along those lines? And so a guy not long ago wrote me an email and basically said, you're an idiot. Nothing on your website is worth anything. You need to take it all off, etc. And I said, okay, appreciate your writing. Could you give me the one piece of evidence that you think is the most powerful to prove evolution and disprove creation? And here's what he wrote back. Yes, I can. He said, the fact that humans grow gill slits when they are growing in the womb, that proves evolution is true and creation is not. I wrote him back and I said, that's interesting. I appreciate you presenting that to me. You know that the evolutionary community itself has disproven that over 100 years ago. And that is not true. Humans never have gill slits. Those are folds that grow into something completely other than gills. No gill slits on any human has ever been documented because it doesn't happen. Your biggest proof of evolution, human gill slits, is not proof, and we've known it for 100 years. Sent that back. He said, yep. He said, that's why creation is better. He said, that's why evolution is better than creation, because I can change the evidence that I have that proves something, but you're stuck with the Bible. Well, number one, every statement in the Bible has proven to be scientifically accurate, and there's not a single exception to any statement in the book. But number two, your biggest piece of evidence that you said proved evolution to you, I dismantled in 3 sentences because your own evolutionary community admits it's not true, and you come back and say, yeah, well, that's why evolution is better. You see the problem there. If you start looking at this stuff with an open mind, critically considering it and looking at it carefully, well, then you realize a lot of the stuff in the books, it's just not doing what it's said to be doing. Now, I don't know if you've seen this. This is horse evolution. Here is the little Hyracotherium that has 3 toes, and these toes gradually get smaller and all fuse into one toe, and here's the modern horse. And this is put in your textbook as the epitome of evolution. You had something kind of like a fox terrier, and it evolved all the way up into a horse. Now, this picture has been multiplied millions and millions of times in scientific books all over the world. Now, George Gaylor Simpson in 1953 said the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Where did that happen? If it didn't happen in nature, where does this stuff happen? On the page of a textbook that is not even true. So he says, if you want to go to nature and try to find what we just wrote on that textbook page, you'll never find it. It's not out there. Well, why are you using it then to prove evolution if it's not in nature? Do you know if they stripped everything from all of the textbooks that they knew wasn't correct? You know what you'd have left in a textbook that's supposed to teach evolution? If it was a 100-page textbook before that, it'd be 12 after that, and the 12 pages wouldn't prove anything about evolution. They would just make statements that would be accurate like biogenesis, and it wouldn't show how biogenesis could be violated to get something to evolve. You wouldn't have any material left. And so you start looking at the horse evolution, and this is the second aspect of, you will see multiple examples of this. And this idea is called homology. And here's what they say, basically, if something looks similar, then it has to be related. And so they'll pull up a picture. I've got a friend from school, and when he had his first child, his wife had his first child, this baby looked exactly like, it was the spitting image of my friend. You could, out of 1 billion people, if you'd have said, here's the dad, can you find the son? You would have picked this little, at 3 months old looked exactly like his dad. You ever seen a little baby like that? Looks just like his dad at 3 months old. His dad's 45, and he looks just like his dad, and he's 3 months. I mean, you could put them together because they were similar. They looked similar. And so the evolutionary community says, if you see anything that looks similar, it has to be related. And so here's what they will tout to you. They will say, look, the wrist bones of the human, and the wrist bones of the cat, and the wrist bones of the whale, and the wrist bones of the bat, they're all very similar. And so similarity has to mean they're related. Well, now there's a problem with that. There are lots of things that are similar that aren't related. Go out into the driveway, the parking lot, and count how many wheels are on the vehicles out there. What are you, generally speaking, going to find? You're going to find 4. Now, every now and then you'll see an exception that some of them will have 3, some of them will have 2. You'll have a motorbike or a bicycle or something like that. Generally speaking, 4 wheels on every single car out there. What's the substance of the tires? Most all the time. Made out of rubber, yeah. And generally speaking, what kind of fuel do most of them use? Most of them use gasoline. Some of them use diesel, but most of them are gas. And what do they use in those gas-running engines to cause that gas to combust and to make an explosion? And what do they screw in there? Those spark plugs. And you know what? All those cars out there have 4 tires that are rubber, and they use gas because they're all related. The same birth car gave birth to all of them. Is that what you got going? No, they're related. Why? Because they have similar functions, and they're going to be functioning on the same roads. Those cars will be running on the same roads. They're going to be stopping at the same gas stations. They're going to need the same stuff. Now, if a creator created the world and he knew that humans and animals were going to be eating the same food, will there be some similarity there? If he knew that humans and animals were going to be walking over the same types of terrain, humans and animals were going to be drinking the same water, could common look and design be from a common designer and not from a common ancestor? Oh, absolutely, positively. And so when you start to look at, these tables, they've all got 4 legs. Well, why do most all of these tables have 4 legs? Because gravity is going to insist that if you want to balance them, probably most of the time, you can find a table with 3 legs every now and then, but most of the time, it's just more convenient to make 4 because it's the easiest way to balance something. And so these tables, they don't look the same because they all have the same birth mother. They look the same because they're designed by an intelligent designer who knows they're all going to function in the same areas with the same physical constraints. And so when a person says, hey, all of these animals, they've got similar structures. Well, number one, they've got a lot of dissimilar ones. But number two, wouldn't a creator who knew that all the animals and people were going to be functioning in the same arenas would use some common structures? Yeah, so that doesn't prove evolution at all either. As you start looking at this information, you realize that what you've been taught in schools that supposedly proves evolution, well, it's just not right. In fact, if you were to look at it with an open mind and you were to study it carefully and critically consider it, well, here's what would happen. Several years ago, it was actually 2010, I looked up my email not long ago. I was in Swartz Creek, Michigan. And right outside of Swartz Creek, Michigan, there was the congregation. I think we had a group of about this big, maybe, it might have been about half the size, actually. And I had a young girl that was a freshman in my lecture there as we were talking, did this similar information, been doing the same information, and I'm going to keep doing it until they take it out of the textbooks, probably. And talked about English peppered moths, talked about Haeckel's embryos, etc. Lots of this stuff, it just seems, it kind of seems academic, doesn't it? I mean, when's the next time you feel like you're actually going to see an English peppered moth in nature? Okay, probably not happening. When's the next time you're going to start compare fossils from horses to see if this happens in nature and it doesn't? That's probably not happening. So you almost think it's kind of academic. This girl was sitting through the lecture. She was awake. She had obviously gotten enough sleep to stay awake through the lecture, and she was probably listening halfway about. But she looked up and she saw the pepper moss and stuff. The next week in her biology class, she sends me an email. She says, the week after you came to Swartz Creek, I was in biology class, and they were teaching us evolution, and they used the English peppered moths and Haeckel's embryos to prove to us that evolution is true. She said, I almost laughed out loud because you showed us that those things aren't proof at all. Now, would that have been a very different situation if she had gone into that biology class and she hadn't been aware of this information, and they taught her about English peppered moths and they taught her about Haeckel's embryos, and nobody had told her the other side of it? You know, the proverb writer said, the person who pleads his case first seems right until his neighbor comes and answers him. Bob Ritter said, hey, we want to get this idea of selective adaptation across to the kids. Later on, they can look at it more critically. I want you to think about that statement. Let it sink in. When is later on for most kids in school? Is there a class in most of your college courses, in a 101 class, freshman class, stuff we told you proved evolution but doesn't, 101? Hey, let's now start looking at this stuff more critically. Is there a class like that? In fact, as we were putting some of this material together, I was looking at one of the writings from a man who had a PhD, and he was looking at some of these things that had been taught to him, and he was angry because he had a terminal degree in a scientific discipline and had never heard that the English peppered moths weren't real evidence for evolution. And he was mad at that, as well he should be, because when is later on? You know, lots of times later on is if you happen to be at a seminar like this, and you come and you listen to this material. Do you know right now, every single day at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., kids pour into that museum by the thousands. In fact, I was there several years ago, and I asked the curator or one of the people working there, I said, how many kids come into this museum every day? He said 10,000 every day. 10,000 a day. Now, at the Washington Smithsonian Museum, there is a shrine to horse evolution where they go through that horse evolution just exactly like you saw on that page, and they talk about how this little Hyracotherium evolved into modern horse, and it's not true at all. I'm going to say it's a $500,000 to $1 million series of drawings and exhibit. 10,000 kids a day see that. How many kids every day are told, oh, by the way, we know that doesn't prove evolution? How many kids a year? I travel around, I do about 10 to 12 of these seminars a year. My coworkers do about the same, so we'll do about 30 of these seminars a year, and we'll get to talk to maybe 5,000 kids a year. And 5,000 kids who decide they're going to take their time out of a Saturday, and they're going to come and sit through a lecture. Those are the ones that actually get to hear, oh, by the way, the stuff they're teaching you in those textbooks, that's not really true, and they've known it's not really true for years, but they just keep teaching it to you because they don't think you'll stop and look at it with an open mind and study it carefully and critically consider it. Well, you know, I think it's time that we just say, hold on just a second. I'm willing to be respectful in your class. I'm willing to listen, but I am not going to accept what you say just because you say it. In fact, I'm going to look at it with an open mind. I'm going to study it carefully. I'm going to critically consider it, and then I'm going to make up my mind. I'm going to make a decision then, and when you do that, well, what happens is you'll end up like my friend who is the rocket scientist. You'll come out of that and you'll realize, hey, the stuff I've been hearing that supposedly proved that, it just didn't do anything of the sort. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking your time to put some good stuff into your repertoire of answers for these scientific questions. Here's what I'd like to say finally. Christianity is the most robust philosophical system that there ever has been. Creation and Christianity. There's no holes in it at all. So don't be afraid to look at it with an open mind. Study it as carefully as you want. Look at it as critically as you want. Put it under any test that you want. Ask any question about it. We're not afraid of questions as New Testament Christians. Anything you've got, ask it. And I think what you'll find is when you start prodding and probing Christianity, you'll find that it is the most sound, solid philosophical system that's ever been devised because God, the Creator, is the one who devised it. Thank you very much.